Thank you, Evan. Thank you all for being here. It is indeed a pleasure for me to be here and give this talk. I've visited ICT over the course of 10 years from time to time, and I've always been amazed at the kind of projects that you all are working on. And it is just an eye-opening experience for me to be here. So when I designed this talk, I think I was a little bit ambitious in terms of wanting to focus on two different aspects of my research. One is a lot of perception work that I do once I started at Clemson University about 2.5, 3 years ago. And then another that has to do with my long-term... Oops. Another that has to do with my I'm trying to see what I'm doing wrong here.
The mic and the podium's covered high.
Yeah. Can I turn this off by any chance, the podium mic, which is causing interference, I think? I'm sorry about that. Y'all must have gone deaf back there.
The podium is muted.
Okay.
Is it still?
All right. Or maybe I'll try to stand far away from the podium. Okay. I think it's fixed the problem now. All right, so there are two key areas of research that I do. One is on basically applied perception, where I examine depth and space perception in virtual worlds. And then the second is on behavior modeling for virtual characters in interactive simulations. So very briefly, I want to quickly introduce the Virtual Environments Group, which is led by Larry Hodges, my colleague, and longtime associate, and his students, and me and my students, which consist of undergraduate students as well as graduate students. So the kinds of things that we do in the Virtual Environments Group, we certainly build lots of different systems, interactive systems in virtual reality. We do presentations of our work, and we practice our presentations, at least the students do, in weekly sessions in the lab. And we also do lots of experiments. So you see some of the screenshots of the experiments. We celebrate birthdays and various milestones of members of the lab, and we also goof off from time to time. So some of the projects that the students have worked on, and this is one of Larry Hodges and his students, have created a post-stroke upper extremity rehabilitation application that's using the Microsoft Connect. And Patrick Dukes, who's here doing an internship, worked on this project, and it won the 2012 it took second place in the 2012 Microsoft Imagine Cup. So besides that, we also have a virtual patient in which the motivation for the application is to train medical practitioners in pediatric interviewing skills. So, there is a rich conversation model, and research in the conversation model has taken place with respect to this project in order to provide realistic human-like interactions between the patient and the nurse practitioner. And one of the nice things about this particular application is that the conversation model has to facilitate multi-party dialogue between the virtual mother, the child, and the nurse practitioner. So along the wings of the Virtual Human Toolkit and a lot of the work that's been done here, we're also working on conversational modeling. So some of the other work that I've done includes a virtual reality system to teach and train people in identifying the signs and symptoms.
Just use this.
Okay. So here's work that Lauren Dukes, who's also here doing an internship, has been leading the development of. And this is basically a virtual reality system with which we teach nursing practitioners in identifying the signs and symptoms of patient deterioration. There's a lot of work that's gone into the interaction design in this application, where you have touchscreen-based interaction with equipments and the nurses in the virtual clinical environment, and then you have a data recording interface that is a mock electronic health record system of a well-known hospital network, and this has been funded by the St. Francis Hospital Foundation. So, and apart from that, I've also been working recently in the last year or so on a Department of Labor and National Science Foundation grant that's been funding the work of using virtual reality systems, interactive virtual reality systems, to teach and train aviation automotive technical students in various cognitive and psychomotor skills. And some of these include things like interactive metrology, learning to use precision measurement instruments to do quality control type of exercises. And we practice that in the virtual world. Things like interactive circuitry, where in a mock breadboard activity, you learn how to use the ammeter, the voltmeter, ohm meter, etc. And so some of the research questions that we are working on, apart from application development, is learning the impact of bimanual interaction on learning cognitive psychomotor skills with respect to the aviation automotive domain. So a student of mine has facilitated two-handed interaction metaphor in these precision measurement exercises, and we are examining the impact of this bimanual interaction versus traditional mouse and keyboard-based interaction, or a 2D interaction using two mice. So, and the key question is, what are these effects on psychomotor skills learning? But anyway, I'm not going to talk more about these projects. I just want to give you a highlight. The projects that I'm going to focus on is done by a subgroup in the Virtual Environments Laboratory that we call the Applied Perception Research Group. So it consists of myself and a perceptual psychologist, Chris Pagano, who's done a lot of research in the past, before I met him, on near-field depth perception in the real world. So with that, we've been working on various problems with respect to depth perception in the virtual world, where we are keenly focused on these three key research aspects. So number one, we're trying to understand how users perceive depth in space, especially in the near field, in close quarters interaction in the virtual world. And what are the factors that affect spatial perception? So a whole host of factors that have to do with perceiving depth and space that are important to consider in our research. So we've been examining those in step-by-step fashion via carefully constructed studies. And then third, how do we enhance virtual environments to overcome perceptual limitations that we have noticed in operator performance in the virtual world? Okay. So with that, I'm going to talk about the first study that we did as soon as I arrived at Clemson. And this was published in the ACM Symposium on Applied Perception in 2011, and was subsequently also invited to the Journal on Transactions on Applied Perception as one of the top 5 papers at SAP that year. So what we did was to compare near-field depth perception between real and virtual environments. So when it comes to virtual reality, with respect to computer-generated worlds, you're all very familiar with the plethora of applications that are out there, from the gaming industry to virtual reality simulations for training, and virtual reality therapy simulations that started perhaps in the late 90s, etc. And all of these computer-generated environments. So, and with respect to displaying these environments in an immersive fashion, one either uses a large screen immersive display, which consists of multiple displays, such as this cave example in the bottom right at the University of Chicago, or in these curved displays, such as the ones that are in the Max Planck Institute, and where the imagery is generated in first-person perspective with a wide field of view. And alternatively, you could also use a head-mounted display where you have stereoscopic view of the environment with a left eye, right eye perspective with appropriate optics to facilitate the left eye, right eye views and to perceive depth in the scene. And it may also be joined with a head tracking system so that you have head-coupled view of the environment in first-person perspective. So you guys are familiar with that. And what ranges between the physical environment and the fully virtual world in that continuum is perhaps augmented reality, where there's a mix of these virtual entities in the physical environment that could be facilitated for viewing via a see-through display, for instance. So our research concerns immersive virtual reality. At least initially, we have explored depth and space perception in immersive virtual reality via a head-mounted display metaphor. And our project essentially is motivated by the fact that we have noticed that depth perception is poor, and there's a lot of research that suggests that depth perception is poor. And depth perception is, if you ask why do we care, depth perception is important because it's one of the low-level tasks, perceptual tasks, for a lot of the high-level cognitive functions, such as shape perception, speed perception. And so perception of distances is very important because it is the most important primitive in higher level processes. So, and if you look at a lot of our research is motivated by psychology literature. So if you look at the psych literature, when it comes to how people use space around them, there is the classification of space into 3 different categories. Think of personal or near field is like where your eyes are located, from the location of where your eyes are, where you're viewing objects, to about your maximum arm reach, which might be a little less than a meter. And then action space is where is an extension of your maximum arm reach to about 30 meters or so. So within your personal space or near field, in this close quarters, you can interact with objects in a natural manner and affect changes directly. And then you have action space from maximum arm reach to about 30 meters. You can think of this as your room size environment where you can affect changes either directly or indirectly by walking across to them. And then you have vista space, which is 30 meters and beyond, that encompasses your world view of the environment, right, your large-scale view. So the research that we are concerned with is in personal space or near field within a person's maximum arm reach, where they can directly interact with objects in the virtual world. And distance perception has been heavily studied in action space, which is, from maximum arm reach to beyond, to about 30 meters or so, and also in vista space. But there hasn't been a lot of work in near field or personal space. So why do we care for near field depth perception or personal space depth perception? Why is this a problem that interests us? Because of late, with the advancement in virtual reality technology, there's been a lot of work that's been done in which you have applications in which you have fine dexterous tasks that are being simulated, such as the surgical simulation. Here is an example and these are screenshots from various commercial ventures where they're doing near-field interaction to do very fine psychomotor skills learning or visual motor skills learning, in which, in the application in the center from SimQuest, one is learning how to suture a wound or perform some sort of arthroscopic surgery via a haptic simulator, very close quarters interaction. On the right, there is a simulator that shows you how to do LASIK or trains medical practitioners in LASIK surgery, right? In ocular surgery, a very fine motor task indeed. So in these kinds of applications, where you have close quarter interactions and you have a stereoscopic view of a computer-generated world to practice these kinds of interactions, we want to know, how well does depth perception operate in these kinds of environments, because they're very important for these applications. And I can cite other applications besides the medical domain, like welding, etc., painting, and so on. So what has been done with respect to measurement? How do people typically measure perception? You can't, we're not in the age of the matrix yet, where you can plug in directly into the brain and measure one's perception. So we measure perception via action, via some responses. And so one of the common techniques in measuring depth and space perception, especially depth perception in action space, is a technique called blind walking, where a person views a target at some distance. These measurement techniques have been applied in distances that are 6 feet and beyond, typically in related work. And so with respect to blind walking, a participant views a target that's on the ground plane at some distance from them. And then after viewing the target for a few seconds, they close their eyes, and then they walk to where they perceive the target to be. Okay? And if there was feedback provided in a closed-loop manner, then they can open their eyes when they reached a certain distance to look around and see how well they did with respect to where they were relative to the target. Then another measurement protocol that's been commonly used is called beanbag throwing, where after a few trial practices throwing a beanbag, a participant views a target at some distance, then closes their eyes, and then tosses a beam back to the perceived location of the target. So without feedback, we can measure, without visual feedback that is, when they do this task blindfolded, we can measure absolute depth perception in that manner, see how well it has really worked, right? And so, in that manner, you can measure medium to, action space depth perception in the virtual world, either via blind walking or throwing. Another alternative technique that people have used is called imagine time walking, where we measure the participant's average walking speed prior to the experiment, and then the participant is asked to view a target, close their eyes, and imagine walking to the target via a stop clock. So they would have a stopwatch. They would just show us how much time it would have taken to reach that target. And then we can compute how much, what was their depth perception based on the estimated time to reach the target. So what have people found so far in the literature? When it comes to action space, there's been a lot of work. Here is a graph that shows the relationship between actual distance to perceived distance. And the vertical shows 1-to-1 performance. And what people have noted with respect to depth perception is that in action space there's this vast underestimation. Okay, so there are a couple of research papers I've cited here. There's plenty in this area that's been done. So Messig and Durgan has noted 23% underestimation via a blind walking technique in an immersive virtual environment. Sam has noted about as much as 30% underestimation via blind walking as well as throwing. So they have used two measurement protocols, and they have noted underestimation, significant underestimation of up to about, on average, about 30% of the actual distance. So, and there's also been some work done by my previous colleagues at Iowa, Gretchen et al. In 2010, which compared distance estimation between the real world with the see-through display, and where they've simulated the weight of the head-mounted display on a participant's head to see if that has any impact at all on depth perception. And then immersive virtual environment viewed with a head-mounted display, augmented reality with a see-through display, a photorealistic environment on a large screen immersive display consisting of multiple displays, 4 displays specifically, and then immersive virtual environment viewed with a large screen immersive display. Okay? So they found that, and they performed imagine time walking as well as blind walking to targets in all these conditions. And what they noted was that with imagine time walking, all the VR, large screen immersive display, as well as the augmented reality conditions, all showed underestimation at some relative levels as compared to the real-world condition. The real-world head-mounted display condition did not differ from the actual distance. So the performance in the real-world condition viewed through a see-through head-mounted display was close to the vertical in terms of performance. But there was underestimation in all these other conditions, VR, large screen immersive display, as well as augmented reality. And augmented reality showed the least of those underestimations. So with blind walking, the same exact effects were found. But the real-world head-mounted display did show some underestimation in the blind walking method. One thing I would say about each of these measurement protocols, blind walking, imagine time walking, beanbag throwing, etc., in the psychology literature, perceptual psychologists tend to lean towards response variables that are more immediate rather than delayed, so that it would directly measure or allow us to directly measure our innate perception of depth and space. So the immediacy of the response variable is very important, because if you have blind walking or imagine time walking where you allow participants to think about how and contemplate where they perceive the object to be, there is a lot of cognitive influence in that process. And so you're not directly measuring perception action. Okay, what else has been done? So there's been some work that has also shown that the level of detail, the visual realism of the environment matters. So Kunz et al. Has shown that in a study, and this is similar to some of the work that Vicky Interante at the University of Minnesota has also performed, where if you have a photorealistic environment as what's shown on the right versus a poor textured environment where you have low resolution textures on the left, and that are not photorealistic at all, flat shaded, if you will. And participants have noted that the underestimation seems to be more severe in these sparse environments versus these highly realistic environments. Okay, so environment realism seems to matter as well. So with respect to near space real world experiments, some of my colleague at Clemson, Chris Pagano, has done a lot of work in the past on examining near field depth perception. That's actually the reason why I decided to examine near field depth perception in the virtual world, and was confident to do so because I had an expert by my side. So what he had done in the past was that he had done some experiments where, for instance, participants were fitted with a camera to view the real world, and they also had a video camera, a video feed with optics that displayed the left eye and right eye view to the participants. And so with that particular system, the view of the environment could be recorded and then siphoned real time through an optics to the person's eyes. So he could then play with, for instance, adding delay to the view of the environment and see how it affected one's perception of depth and space, among a lot of other things. So participants in this setup viewed targets that are between 50% to 90% of a person's maximum arm reach. And then he examined two kinds of responses: verbal reports, which are, and the reason to examine verbal reports is because it is inherently cognitive, because when you perceive distances to objects, you have to interpret it in a cognitive fashion, and then be able to describe what you perceived. And so in that process, there's a lot of cognitive influences, and he wanted to look at verbal reports to see how does the perception action versus perception cognition action differ. So he compared verbal reports to physical reaches with the participants' eyes closed, and so the verbal reports seemed to be more erroneous as compared to the physical reaches. The physical reaches were more accurate as compared to the verbal reports. That was one of the results that he found. And also, the verbal reports were more prone to delay in perception introduced through this system. So he introduced a delay of 1 second to 3 seconds in the visual feed that they got of the environment through this system, and we found that that had an impact on the verbal reports, but not on the physical reaches. So again explains how the physical reach action variable is closely connected to our underlying perception of depth and space. And perceptual psychologists, at least ecological perceptual psychologists, believe that perception action is two sides of the same coin. They're so closely connected, as opposed to perception cognition, right? So, and he also found that, for instance, if you told participants, and it might be on another slide, there it is. So in another experiment, participants were told that the distances that they viewed targets to be were either 50 to 100% of the maximum arm reach, or 25 to 90% of the maximum arm reach. They were either at a further range or at a closer range of distances to them. And he found that the verbal reports matched the participants' expectations of what they were told and what they would find in the environment, but the physical reaches did not. So the physical reaches, when participants used physical reach to show where they perceived the targets to be, that seemed to be more closely aligned to the actual distance of the target. But then when participants were told via instruction that they would expect to find the target either between 50 to 100% or closer, the range of distances that they reported closely matched what they were instructed, right? Their expectation. So again, attests to the cognitive influence that plays on a person's response variable to how they perceive the virtual world. So, and my good colleague at Mississippi State, Gurjot Singh, Ed Swan, and also Adam Jones, who's here now, have all investigated near-field depth perception. And so Singh et al. In 2010 had an apparatus that was initially used in Ellis and Menzies, and they investigated in 2010 how near-field depth perception worked in augmented reality. So the task was to place a real LED pointer and the virtual pyramid was used as a target here. And using an LED pointer, they could show in a closed-loop fashion where they perceive the target to be, or in an open-loop fashion, they could also use a slider to show where they perceive the target to be. And the experiment was done between a person's maximum arm reach and somewhat slightly beyond. And it was sort of an indirect measurement using the slider approach. Okay. They also had an occluder that was either present or absent. And they found underestimation of actual distances in this experiment in near to slightly beyond near field depth perception. And our research interest here is to look at virtual reality as a whole with not augmented reality but full VR in an immersive virtual environment setup, at least initially through a head-mounted display. And then we wanted to know, by using a simple reach task, we wanted to ask two questions. One is, does near-field depth perception differ in an immersive virtual environment as compared to a real world? And do reaches and verbal reports differ between an immersive virtual environment and real world? We also wanted to see what was the cognitive impact of the perceived distance in the immersive virtual environment. Is it similar to the kinds of results that we got in the real world from my collaborators' previous research experience? And our hypothesis, one thing that my collaborator didn't notice before in his prior work on near-field depth perception in real world, is that there was underestimation, even in the real-world condition. But we don't see that in action space. Perceptual judgments in medium field, beyond near field, at least in the work that's been done in the real world previously, all seem to show that perceptual judgments are very close to the vertical. But in the real world condition, people have noticed underestimation, at least my colleague has noticed in the past in a lot of his studies. So we generally estimated that we predicted that there would be underestimation in both the real world as well as in the IVE, with more severe underestimation in the immersive virtual environment. And we didn't know what to expect really for the verbal reports. But we did hypothesize that the verbal reports would be different than the physical reaches. So our experiment was a 2x2 factorial design. We had the dependent variables were verbal reports as well as physical reaches. The viewing condition was real world and immersive virtual environment. Verbal reports and physical reaches were given concurrently. I'll explain how it works in just a minute when I cover the procedure. And our participants randomly performed either the real world or the virtual world condition. First 2 days later, they performed the other condition. So it was a within subjects design, but in order to minimize any carryover effects, we had participants come back a few days later and perform the other condition, right? So, and there were 30 trials per session. Distances were random permutations of, we measured the participant's maximum arm reach, and then the distances presented were random permutation of 5 fixed size distances, 50%, 58%, 67, 75, 82, and 90, 6 of arm length, between 50 to 90% of a maximum arm reach of a participant. And so we decided to use these intrinsic units because from a biomechanical perspective, people are very comfortable with reaching out and affecting changes within their interaction space. And so we wanted to, rather than examine absolute distance perception in the near field with a range of targets that were constant, we wanted to look at targets that were presented within a person's maximum arm reach. Obviously, if a person is petite and small, they would not be able to reach to the further targets, right, if you used a constant range. So what did our apparatus look like? So we constructed an apparatus. Most of it was made out of wood because we used an electromagnetic tracking system. And so we had a participant in a head-mounted display. This is my graduate student, Manan, wearing a head-mounted display, is viewing a target. The target is actually this right here. This is the target face. And that's the target to which they're judging their perceived distances to. And so it's on an optical rail. So the target is on an adjustable stand so that the target face is always produced at eye level to the participant. And the target is adjusted on a stand or ruler so that when we know from measuring the participant's maximum arm reach, what does 50% of the maximum arm reach mean, and we can place the target right there for that particular trial. There's the electromagnetic source, And then we had electromagnetic sensors on a participant's head for head tracking, so that they had head-tracked perspective correction and so on. There was also a sensor behind the target, so that the virtual target was exactly co-located with the physical target, and we calibrated the system to make sure that the virtual and physical was exactly in the same location. And the virtual replica of this apparatus was modeled very carefully to match the physical apparatus. We even used an electronic stylus that came with our tracking system to measure the dimensions of the target block and the stand and things like that in order to model it correctly. There was also a sensor in a participant's stylus that they used to show via physical reach responses where they perceive the target to be. In the real-world condition, we created a field of view occluder so that we matched the field of view of the head-mounted display condition. So the horizontal field of view was measured to be 50 degrees. The vertical field of view was measured to be 38 degrees for this VR 1280 head-mounted display. And that's what we used to create the field of view occluder. And we also made sure that in terms of realism, the virtual environment with the virtual apparatus resembled in every possible way as close as possible to the real-world apparatus. Can any of you tell me which is the virtual and which is the real? There is a dead giveaway in the scene, by the way. Volunteers? Peter, can you tell? Yeah, you're right on. Yeah. Why do you think that is? I'm sorry? Well, thank you. But also the cord. We had a difficult time modeling that cord, where the sensor, that comes out of the sensor to the electromagnetic tracking system. Anyway, so yeah, the right side is the physical environment. The left is the virtual environment. And we use textures of the actual apparatus to model the virtual apparatus. All the tricks in the trade, okay? So, and also when a participant is introduced into the virtual environment, they had a training session in order to get acclimatized to the head-tracked perspective correction and to know that they could move their head around and look at a target and look at the environment, if you will. So the training environment had various images and things, and we asked them a series of questions in order to ensure that they could see all aspects of the scene. So, and get accustomed to the head tracking, head coupled view of the environment. So some of the questions we asked were, what time is on the clock, what's on the TV, etc. And it also enabled us to ensure that the visual clarity was there in the head-mounted display. There was also a static avatar that we placed when the participant looked down, which wasn't very often. Mind you, the field of view is very narrow in this head-mounted display. So it wasn't very often that a participant looked down. But when they did, they would see a static avatar so that it enabled them to be physically grounded in the environment. And that's the reason why we wanted to use this. Psychology literature suggests that having such an avatar allows you to be grounded, makes the participant feel like he or she is really in the environment, and allows them to suspend disbelief and be a part of this egocentric view that they receive in the world. So the procedure, the pretest consisted of an informed consent, stereo and visual acuity tests. We made sure that participants had at least 20/40 vision. 20/40 is what is the visual acuity of the head-mounted display. So their innate vision had to be at least 20/40. We also did a stereo acuity test in order to ensure that participants could see stereo. We measured maximum arm reach in centimeters, and then we measured interpupillary distance. This was used as a parameter in the system, and we secured the equipment to the participant's head. Participants were also familiarized with the head-mounted display in the IVE condition. We also tethered participants to the back of a chair so that as they performed the physical reach responses, that they wouldn't, nudge their shoulder forward in showing us where they perceive the object to be, because this would give us erroneous reading. So we wanted participants consistently to provide physical reach responses in the exact same manner. So for consistency's sake as well, we made sure that we tied them loosely to the chair, not too tightly, so that if they reach out, they had some tactile feedback that allowed them to correct their actions, if you will. So what was the procedure for each trial? So participants viewed a target and then said, yes, I'm ready to make a perceptual judgment. Then the vision was occluded in the immersive virtual environment condition. The experimenter hit a key press on the simulation keyboard. Vision was removed from the head-mounted display. In the real-world condition, participants were asked to close their eyes. And then the target was swung out of the way. Participants then gave a verbal report in this intrinsic unit of maximum arm reach. It's about 50% of my maximum arm reach or 60% of my maximum arm reach, and followed by physical reach. Okay, so the verbal reports and physical reaches were concurrently given with each trial. And then the experimenter hits a key on a keyboard and logs the sensor data with a key press. Of course, there's also a complete automatic log, but having logged the sensor data with a key press enables the experimenters to quickly analyze the data, because we can just go exactly to the sensor log locations rather than parse through the continuous logs. So participant places the stylus back on the stylus dock. Participant hears white noise as the experimenter adjusts the next target distance on the apparatus. And so while the target is being slid across, there is a screeching noise, and this could provide a auditory cue as where that next trial distance is going to be. So in order to eliminate that, we had white noise. And the target was moved to the next distance. Vision was restored. So okay, let's get to the cool stuff. So what did we find? What did the universe reveal to us? So from the results, from the analysis of the results, we basically, for analysis, we did a multiple regression where we looked at the main effect of actual distance to make sure that the system is actually working, the main effect of condition. Is there a difference between immersive virtual environment viewing versus real-world viewing? And then we looked at the interaction, which is basically the slopes. And we chose multiple regression because we were looking at a relationship between one continuous variable, actual distance, to another continuous variable, perceived distance, okay, rather than a categorical variable such as what you have in an ANOVA. So now what we found was that there was a significant effect of actual distance, which is not reported here, on the perceived distance. So we know that the system is working. And then these are results that are shown for physical reach responses. So actual distance versus reach estimates via physical reach. And so the red dots, red circle, sorry, and the red line indicates the linear regression profile for the real world condition. The blue line indicates the linear regression profile for the IVE condition. And even though the effect size was very, very small, but the intercepts between the two regression lines were significantly different, which indicates that there is a significant effect of condition. So the viewing condition was significant. There was a difference, there was an effect between the IVE and the real-world viewing. That difference in intercept was approximately 2 centimeters in distance. But the variance in responses was, for the condition accounted for about 6% of the variance in responses. Okay, just to give you some perspective. And when we remove the interaction term, the percentage of variance accounted for was close to 10%. So the lines look very, very similar, but only the intercepts differed by approximately quite close to 2 centimeters here. And we found that there was underestimation in both the real world as well as in the IVE condition. And mind you, we are looking at distances that are less than 1 meter. So what happened with respect to the verbal reports? So with respect to verbal reports, it's really surprising that we had one outlier where a participant reported that with verbal report that the distance perceived was at 0% of the maximum arm reach, which really surprises us. But anyway, when we looked at the difference between the real world and the virtual world with respect to verbal reports, we found that there's a massive underestimation in both. The distances between the intercepts was approximately 6 centimeters, and there was a significant effect of condition and also a significant interaction present, which means that the slopes in the linear regression profiles between the IVE and real-world condition were significantly different. There's a large amount of variance in participants' responses in the verbal reports as compared to physical reaches. So physical reaches participants tend to be more consistent than in the verbal reports. The R-squared for physical reaches were closer to 1. The R-squared for verbal reports in both conditions, participants it was closer to 0. Okay? Then we also did an analysis looking at the differences between the response variables. And what we found that was interesting was that the magnitude of the differences between the intercepts, between the two linear regression profiles of the physical reach as well as the verbal reports in both the IVE viewing as well as the real-world viewing were very similar. So magnitude of the difference between the intercepts were very, very similar in both conditions. And those were the key results that we found. So with respect to, there's underestimation in both real-world and virtual world condition, more underestimation, higher variance of responses in the verbal reports as compared to physical reaches. And so with this, we're intrigued in the sense that we find this underestimation in the IVE as well as in the real world, and there seems to be less underestimation in the, if you look at the linear regression profiles, they do cross over in the sense that there seems to be less of an underestimation in the IVE at closer distances, but more as distances keep increasing. So, and we also find this interesting difference between verbal and physical reach responses. So there's been a lot of discussion, what I know about the neurological theories and perception theories is very much perfunctory. So from what I understand, there seems to be, a dual pathway theory is one of the popular theories that are out there, in which people have suggested that there is a perception pipeline, there's a perception channel for cognition and a perception channel for action that are two different streams. And there are others who have identified that perhaps there's only one type of perception, which is becoming more popular these days, is that there's only one perception channel, but the way that it's used might be different, in which you have one stream that's used for action, another for cognition, okay? And that could account for some of the effects. So for this, the follow-up study that we did with respect to this work is that we wanted to examine the impact of perceptual calibration. That is, if we give you visual and haptic feedback, can it correct for some of these perceptual limitations? That was the next question that we asked. And this was published last year at ACM SAP. And we are keenly interested in effects such as recalibration. I'm sure everybody here has, and around the world, have experienced recalibration in some way. It's defined as basically how most people have the experience of some sort of recalibration when performing regular activities under irregular circumstances. So for example, you can think of a baseball pitcher pitching on a windy day. So when he trains in a training pitch, perhaps he's not trained in those windy conditions, but he's able to recalibrate when he's experiencing some irregular circumstance that are beyond his training using his experience, right? And that's how recalibration works. Another example of perceptual calibration and recalibration is the sense that, for example, when you get on a moving sidewalk, and as soon as you get on the moving sidewalk, during our normal travel, we are used to optic flow that we experience with natural walking conditions. As soon as we get on a moving sidewalk, this increase in optic flow is a little jarring, right? But then we immediately calibrate to that, and we overcome the effect of that immediate jarring or overwhelming optic cue, increase in pace of optic flow. And likewise, the same effect happens when you get off a moving sidewalk as well. So those are common examples of recalibration, but we are experiencing this all the time. Even when you reach out to grab a phone, with the peripheral view cues that you have with your vision, you are able to, even though you're looking at something else, those peripheral cues are enough to guide your action and calibrate and pick up an object at a distance. So one of the classic experiments that has happened with respect to perceptual calibration and its effect on depth perception in the real world is done by John Reiser and Herb Pick at the University of Minnesota. This is one of the coolest experiments in applied perception, I think, in which a person has to walk on a treadmill with optic flow that was either faster or slower than the actual walking speed, okay? And this is the exact setup here, this illustration over here. So this is a treadmill that was lugged around by this tractor in a field. And so the tractor basically allowed a participant to go at faster than their walking speed in terms of experiencing higher optic flow, or slower than their walking speed in order to experience slower optic flow. Okay? And then after some time in this experience, the participant was blindfolded, got off the treadmill, and then they viewed targets. Their blindfold was removed. They viewed target as various distances, and then they were again blindfolded and asked to walk to the perceived location of these targets. And what they found was that those with optic flow faster would produced by their walking speed underestimated to distances to the targets, and those that experience slower optic flow as compared to their walking speed overestimated to the perceived distances of the targets. So this is really interesting in the sense that there is the optic flow calibrations affect our perception of distances, right? At least immediately after the recalibration experience has occurred. And I guess these researchers have not heard of virtual reality at that time, because we know that we can do this quite easily in the virtual world, right? Manipulating optic flow with travel. So, and also Richardson and Waller in circa 2007 had done some experiments in which, after interacting with an IVE, egocentric distance estimation improved from, say, around 56% massive underestimation to about 94% using blindfolded and triangulated walking. Okay? And one of the interesting things they also experienced here was that there were interesting after effects where after perceptual calibration in the virtual world, immediately afterwards, if they did a few trials of blind walking depth perception in the real world, there seems to be the distance estimation was altered compared to just the real walking depth perception alone. So there is some evidence of persistence of this calibration effect into the real world from the IVE. So here are some of Richardson and Waller's results. You have the pre-interaction phase where this is prior to perceptual calibration, and then this is after perceptual calibration. You can see that their responses have improved significantly. So what are we trying to contribute here to the whole in the literature? What we want to do is, given a simple reaching task, a perception action task with an immediate response variable, such as physical reach, we conducted an experiment where we want to look at pre-test baseline depth estimation interaction, where we want to look at the effect of visual versus haptic feedback on a post-test depth estimation phase. So recalibration to the IVE would be evidenced by improved depth estimation in the post-test compared to the pre-test was one of the working hypothesis. And we also measured verbal reports, and we believe that verbal reports would be less accurate than reaches and would show greater underestimation of distances. And we additionally hypothesized that perhaps verbal reports would not be affected by calibration, but physical reaches could be affected by calibration, right? Because if, in fact, the perception to cognition versus perception to action theory is correct, then the calibration effect might work more on the perception-action pipeline as compared to the perception-cognition pipeline. So our procedure consisted of the same apparatus as what I'd shown you in the first study. We had 15 participants. There were 3 phases: pre-test without feedback. 2 days later, participants came back, and they had this calibration phase, and then immediately after calibration, they had the post-test where they again did a depth estimation task. The key differences we were looking for was the difference in performance between the pre-test and the post-test phases. We used 5 random permutations of fixed sizes of targets, fixed distances to targets, between 50% and 90% of the participants' maximum reach. And interaction, basically we had random permutations of targets we wanted to present them with targets that are in the closer range, between 50 to 75% of that maximum arm reach, because we were also interested in seeing whether it calibrated distances beyond from that 75% to 90% range. If they only received calibration to that closer range, of distances where we provided visual and haptic feedback, did it also have an effect on another range of distances beyond the range where they received calibration? Was one of the questions we asked. The same apparatus was used. I'll skip through all this and jump to the results that we found. So here in this chart, you see this relationship between actual distance and reach estimates for physical reach responses. The blue circles and the blue dotted line shows you the linear regression profile for the pre-test. This is prior to calibration. And then the green line shows you the post-test. Okay, this is after calibration. And the green X's show you the post-calibration data. So what we find is that there is a significant effect of condition, or session in this case, between the pre-test and the post-test. So and if you can think of ideal performance here as having an intercept of 0 and a slope of 1, what we find here is that there is an increase in slope, and the intercepts has been shifted closer to 0 from the pre-test phase. Okay, and when we also look at the correlation coefficient R squared, we find that the R squared is increased, so participants are more consistent in their responses after the calibration phase. Okay. And if you compare this to results of experiments that have been conducted earlier with, say, Richardson and Waller's experiments, what have we added to the literature? It's mainly the fact that with Richardson and Waller, the distances that they have examined are between 1 meter and to beyond, up to about 4 meters or so. But the distances that we are looking at is from where the participant is located to about 1 meter or less than a meter, is in that range. So we are trying to fill the gap in that region of space right there, which is this region here, denoted by red. So that's the region that we have modeled via our multiple regression analysis to look at participants' physical reach responses. Okay. So what about if we compare, we did this earlier experiment where we looked at depth perception differences between the real world and the virtual world, right? So what if we compare the responses of physical reach responses of participants in the real world to what we measured from the impact of visual and haptic feedback? So in this case, the red line, the red dotted line here denotes the linear regression profile of participants in the real world from our first experiment. And we found that there's no significant difference between the green line of the post-calibration phase to the real-world linear regression profiles. In fact, the linear regression profile for the real world as well as for the post-tests are very, very similar, is what we find. Okay? The slopes are a little bit different. But there is a huge difference between the real-world linear regression profile and the pre-test linear regression profile. So there is some sort of change that is happening. But the post-test is not close to the ideal line of intercept of 0 and slope of 1. So there is some interesting effect going on. R squared seems to have increased, slope seems to have changed, the intercept seems to have decreased closer to 0, but it's still a little bit further from the ideal vertical profile that we'd like to see post-calibration. So here are the same numbers that I have described. These are the actual numbers and how between the pre-test, pre-calibration, and post-calibration, here's the change in R squared, the change in slope, and the intercepts as it changed closer to 0. Let's look at the verbal estimates. The verbal estimates overall show a higher amount of variance in the data and massive underestimation as compared to the physical reach responses. And we find that there is no difference in slope between the linear regression profiles before and after the calibration phases, but there is a significant difference in intercept. Okay. And here are the actual numbers. We see that there is the intercept is around negative 30 centimeters. The slope has changed in the sense that it is closer to 1, but not by much. That hasn't changed a whole lot. and R-squared seems to have increased. Okay. In summary, we find that reach distance estimates improved after feedback, particularly at nearer distances, and participants reached further in the pretest as compared to the post-test. So there seems to be, some correction in depth estimation. Reaches in the post-test were very similar to those made in the real-world condition. So if we think of the real-world condition as one alternative gold standard, then the calibration exercises may have affected it such that your perceptual responses are now closer to the real world. And verbal reports all show underestimation more than reaches and less accurate, especially at closer distances. So in terms of future work, where are we going with this right now in my lab? So we are examining near and far space distance estimation for the same participants. So we are looking at if you could calibrate to near field, does it carry over to far off distances in the medium field, right? So, and also we are looking at cross-task calibration. That is, if you received feedback with respect to beanbag throwing, does it also enhance your perceptual responses via physical reach? Okay. So does calibration carry over from one space to another? Does calibration carry over from one task to another? These are all various interesting phenomena that we want to study. Effects of perturbation of virtual target on distance estimation. So we want to look at, say for example, if you have a gain factor where, for instance, you have haptic feedback to the target at some range as compared to the visual target being at another range. Do you then calibrate to the location of the visual target, or do you calibrate to the location of the haptic target? So introducing a gain factor in terms of distortions between the physical and haptic responses is what we want to study in future experiments as well. Comparing visual feedback alone as opposed to haptic feedback, this is a paper that we have just submitted to SAP. I won't say more about it at this time. And carryover effects between immersive virtual environment to real world. So we are also very intrigued by this persistence. So if you could, you do baseline depth estimation in the immersive virtual environment, calibration in the real world, and does it persist if you did, again, post-calibration depth estimation in the immersive virtual environment? Does calibration in the real world translate to calibration in the virtual world, and vice versa? We are also interested in self-avatars, so we want to introduce self-representations in the virtual world. So in this perception action task, where you're physically reaching to the location of targets, if you had a virtual avatar arm, and this is a very highly realistic avatar arm to the right proportion and scale, does it, to your real physical arm, does it calibrate, allow for much more effective calibration of distance estimation? And then what about, say, for instance, we want to perturb the rendering of the self-avatar such that we're only looking at joint angles, which is just the extreme right, versus just a skeletal representation of the avatar, right? I was looking across information theory. Some of the other perceptual cues that we are interested in is that, in the virtual world, everything is crisp. What you see around you in the immersive head-mounted display or in the large screen projection display, the imagery is crisp. What if we provide other visual cues that are important for depth perception beyond stereo and motion parallax, such as perhaps blur, the depth of field blur, where the target looks crisp because that's the location of the actual focus or accommodation of your eyes, and then everything else is linearly blurred from there onwards, either in front of the target or behind. So my students have implemented one of these methods, and we are looking at incorporating this into an experiment and looking at the effects of this on near-field depth perception. And also, do these results translate to large-screen immersive displays, looking across presentation metaphors as well. So this is a research effort that is currently ongoing, where we have a study that we are conducting right now, where we're examining near-field depth perception between a large-screen immersive stereoscopic display versus a head-mounted display. And we are also looking at perceptual calibration in both these display metaphors to see what is the magnitude of calibration in the large-screen immersive display condition as compared to the head-mounted display. Besides this, another area of my work is behavior modeling for virtual humans, but unfortunately, I don't have time to go through this, and I've already spent a lot of your time talking about these two applied perception projects. I will save this for another talk at another day. So with this, I'll be happy to take any questions that you might have.
That is really